it's Ren from Spirits of Fashion. Here on Style and Stories today, we are going to be discussing a little bit about the styles of the Empire and Regency periods. Last time I was here as a guest, we talked about colonial fashion because of the 250th year anniversary. So this time we're going to be talking about what happens after that. So after the French Revolution. So that's what we'll be dealing with today. And then next time we meet, make sure you stay tuned because I'm going to be bringing in a number of items from my own closet that I've thrifted or bought reproduction versions of that you too can imitate some of the styles from this period. Okay, pretty much the Empire period is from 1799 to 1815. It's a French period, and they call it neoclassicism. After the French Revolution, they wanted to have more of a democratic republic. And because of that, it's important that you think about what that was like in Greece and Rome at the time. Classical statues, think about the long statues of both the men and the women. And the women almost look like statues, the way they dress. They came from something which you'll see in a minute, completely different. The court fashions of the 18th century were very lavish and ostentatious. But once the change happened in France after this revolution, the gowns for the women, the dresses became very simple, with an empire waist, which think about the Empire period and Napoleon being Emperor of France. So this whole classical look became very popular. And that eventually spread pretty quickly into much of Europe and the United States. Here is an example of another type, which is the Regency period, the British period. If you love Jane Austen and you've read books by Jane Austen or seen movies based on those books, you'll know that you see a lot of these styles, these very straight styles I just talked about when we talk about the Empire period. It just has a few changes here and there. Now, it says right here, you can see on the screen, 1795 to 1837 was the official Regency period in Britain. But when you think about the actual Prince of Wales becoming regent, that was technically 1811 to 1820. So these two periods sort of blend together nicely. The eldest son of King George III, George III became very ill. He had a lot of mental health disorders, and his son, the Prince Regent, became his regent, which means he was fulfilling the duties of the king because the king became unable to do that. And then once the king died in 1820, then George, the Prince of Wales, became King George IV. So that's what we're looking at as that period of Regency. If you look on the right, this dress also still has a pretty good empire waistline going there. But what we're starting to see by 1820 or so is that at the bottom of the dress, which is still pretty straight, you see more decoration. Like you see these lines of pleats and ruffles on the bottom of the dress. Very typical for 1820s. We'll be covering that later on, not today. Look at this quickly. It's going to change. All right. This is what happened right after all of those fashions that you saw. Let me do that again. Look what happens, a complete change. And if you look at the bottom, which was 1800, this is where you're seeing the style I'm talking about, which is the empire waist. Very low cut. This was all about the décolletage, if you will, and sort of showing off the chest. What would happen during the day is that women would put a modesty piece on it, which was sort of like a scarf or a fichu, they might have called it. And that would cover up any of those parts that weren't supposed to show during the day and not show until evening. So what I've brought with me today, I'm going to get up for a second to show you. This is a reproduction dress that I bought here. And there was a woman who was going out of business on the internet. She had this wonderful business. She was making these dresses, and they were based on the Empire style. So you can see it's got the low neckline. I'll probably be wearing this dress next week when I talk about, or next time I speak to you, and we'll look at other ways that you can mimic something like this. But it's the Empire waist, usually would have a ribbon tied around that at the waistline. And then again, during the day, you might have something filling in that neckline. Very, very straight dress. The hat I bought in a store in Salem, Massachusetts. The hat is a replica of what Kate Winslet's character, Marianne, wore in the movie Sense and Sensibility, based on Jane Austen's book. And it looks very, very similar to the hat she was wearing when the Colonel was reading to her, if you remember that and you've seen it, and she was sitting in a chair recuperating from a very terrible illness that she had. So this hat is a really good replica of that. Again, reproduction versus actual garments. Actual garments would not be around during this time or from this time now, because they're in museums, if they're anywhere. They're too old and fragile for people to be collecting these things on a regular basis. Okay, these are the extreme versions of just what I've been talking about. The very, very high Empire waist, a very sheer type gown, which was usually like a muslin, light muslin, and very light colors often. And the woman is wearing one of those. She's also wearing a cashmere shawl, which was very, very prominent during this time. Think about trade with India and that kind of a thing that's coming up. And she's showing her ankles. Now, it's a full-length dress, but in case the wind blows and you see the ankles, you see, if you look closely, you can see a little design on her stocking of her right foot. That is called clocking, and some men had that too, because if the ankles are going to show at all, they might as well be decorative. The cap she's wearing is called the Red Cap of Liberty, and that is based on, this revolution and wanting liberty from the monarchy. So that's a sign of that particular school of thought. The gentleman is an extreme version too. During this time with the Democratic Republic, they were having sympathy for the working man. So they started wearing more like a working man's trousers, which they called pantaloons. Now his look like breeches or breeches, as some people call them, but they're actually called pantaloons, and we'll see more of that later. And then he's wearing a shirt under that, a chemise under layer. Then he has a cravat, or what's called a stock. The stock is the pink piece that was worn very high up towards his face, and that was a very popular item. And then his jacket, which is long and very dramatic in terms of the lapels. And he has a waistcoat or a vest, as we know it, underneath that coat. As it says here, the female fashion extremists were called merveilleuses, or the marvelous ones, and the men were called incroyables, or the incredible ones, because they took it to the extreme. Okay, sorry about the naked lady, but we have to see how she would dress. She's got pantaloons, or sometimes not pantaloons, they're pantalettes actually, female version, right? Which also have fancy edges on the bottom. Underwear was decorative. Even if you didn't see this underwear ever underneath her dress, it's still considered decorative because that was important to them at the time, even if it wasn't going to be shown. Over that, this is not the dress, this is the undergarment or chemise that goes over the pantalettes. And then you've got a corset. Now, corsets, when we get into later periods, you'll find a much more restrictive looking. This one looks a little gentler on the body because the dress, as I just showed you, is straight. It doesn't need to be really cinched in at the waist. So the women must have loved that. Following that is the petticoat. They needed a lot of layers because without those layers, you'd probably see through the dress. You notice the petticoat is high up, right where the waist, the Empire waist would be. Otherwise, if you could see through the dress at all, you'd see a space between the waistline and the petticoat, which would not look nice. That would be a faux pas in fashion for sure. And here are some wonderful examples of gowns from museums, and they are examples of just what I've been talking about. You see the ones on the left have the puff sleeves. They have a lot of decoration on them. It could have been a wedding gown. And the same with the dress in the middle, even though that's a little plainer, it doesn't mean they didn't use them as wedding gowns as well. The one on the far right is probably more it's probably closer to the 1820 time period because of the decoration that's at the bottom. What did they wear on top of these dresses? Well, the center piece and the one on the far right, that's called a spencer. And the one on the far right is from the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. Many of these things, of course, they're not roaming around out there. They are in museums and being taken very good care of. Spencers were a short version. It hits right where the empire waist would end. And so that spencer could be worn either indoors or out. It was also usually a contrasting fabric from the dress, a contrasting color. And it really doesn't look like much, but it sort of completed the outfit. On the far left, you're looking at what they call a pelisse. And it's spelled this way, P-E-L-I-S-S-E. And the one on the right, of course, is from the Met Museum as well. These were coats, but they follow the line of what's going on underneath. So genius, right? Has an empire waist on the dress, you have an empire waist on the coat that goes over it. Let's talk about menswear. This is my favorite period for men. And I love the high collars on the jacket, the waistcoat underneath that, the chemise, which is the shirt, and the stock or cravat came up very high, as I mentioned earlier. A very popular figure from this period who was impeccable in his dress was Beau Brummel, who was considered a dandy. And he was a very good friend of the Prince of Wales, who we talked about earlier. So he kind of lived the high life with him. He's wearing pantaloons. Now, many times these were made of buckskin, and they were worn quite fitted, even if they had to shrink them, soak them to shrink to fit. Believe it or not, that's true. And they think about the statues that we're talking about, the Greek and Roman statues. So they sort of look statuesque themselves. And he's wearing the waistcoat, which is under the tailcoat. Tailcoat is usually quite straight across. And then in the top, it's straight across. And then it has the tails in the back. He's wearing one of those, and the waistcoat is a little bit longer. So when you see the men from the movies, from Jane Austen's books, that's the style you're going to see. And then under that, there's this stock, which would wrap around the neck and just fold just so. And he was notorious for this. Legend states that his valet, or valet, as the British would say, his valet would bring a number of these white cloths every morning when Beau was getting dressed. And Beau would tie it, each one. If his chin went down and it didn't crease it in just the right way, he would have to put his head down like that. If it didn't crease in the right way, it was out. So apparently the poor valet finally got one, got him to get one right. So he's walking with all of these cloths. And so someone said to him, well, what are you doing with all that? Is that laundry? He said, these are the failures. So even though, he had to waste a lot of cloth, he wanted it to be just right. And that's what a dandy does. He's wearing what are called Hessian boots, which are a type of riding boot, and they have the tassels in the front. And then he's wearing a top hat. Top hat was worn for day wear. That won't become just formal wear until much later in the century. Here's an example of a beautiful, on the right, a beautiful men's outfit, just like we talked about. The tailcoat, he's got his pantaloons on in a very beige fabric. I don't know if it's buckskin, I can't tell. You can see it's got stirrups on the bottom that would cover the boots or the shoes so they don't ride up on him. And it looks like he's wearing a small cravat instead of a stock, and then his waistcoat. On the left is a scene with Miss Marianne and the Colonel Brandon, in Sense and Sensibility, the Jane Austen-based movie. And she's wearing a straw hat. I don't think it's the same one I showed you. I think this is a different one. But it's just cool to see some of the scenes, and you can see how the Colonel is dressed very similarly to what's on the right. These are other examples of men's dress wear. If you're thinking that the hair is kind of funky, what's going on there is because of the way that the top hats fit on the head, you're going to get hat hair. And even back then, they didn't want that. So they had sort of this kind of poof in the center, which would go under the crown of the hat, right at the top of the head. And then the sides were curly. But usually the hat only came down to the top of the curls on the side, so that the hair should look the same when they take the hat off. Seems funny to us now, but that's how they did it back then. On the right, you see this gentleman is wearing what might be a type of greatcoat, which is an outer coat with at least one cape on it. In addition to the actual coat, it has an attached cape. Gives it a lot of style. It can be worn for riding. I've seen them where there are fasteners in the back, what look like buttons in the back. So if you undo those buttons, then the coat becomes wide enough to sit on a horse and have the coat not get bunched up. It'll just fall nicely over the rear of the horse. So I've seen those coats from this time period as well. Here's Mr. Bingley from one of the versions of Pride and Prejudice, Jane Austen's book, of course. And you can see that Mr. Bingley has that little poof on his head. And he's got the sides aren't really curly, but they are sort of full. You can see his stock on this photo on the left, which comes, fairly high up. It's been tied around. And if you can see that his waistcoat also has a high collar and it's standing up. You can see a little bit of that on the right. He's with Mr. Darcy, and they're both wearing the styles of the period. I love that Mr. Bingley has a light-colored top hat and a light-colored jacket on his ensemble. So I love that fact, too. And these are some accessories. To finish up, we're looking at, this is again in the middle, that's a man's top hat, another light color, which is gorgeous. And then on the bottom, there are dancing slippers. Now, that's the only thing I have from this period. I'm going to get up and get them for you. I found these in the Chester Stonehouse Antiques store, and they were in one of the cabinets on the wall, and they're very, very flat. These are called straights. You can see that. If you've ever danced ballet, you know ballet slippers and toe shoes or point shoes are straights, meaning there's no right and left. These are satin, silk satin, of course, and silk does shatter. So we're seeing a little bit of that, but they have the ribbons, these tiny little ribbons that would lace up like it's a point shoe or a toe shoe. And these would be worn for dancing for ladies in the evening. And again, straights, your foot was meant, the shoe would mold onto the foot and get used to being a right or a left, but it wouldn't come that way. So I think that's interesting. On the bottom left are men's walking sticks. Sometimes they folded up for ease of carrying them if they weren't using them. Very popular with all outfits for men for day wear as well. And then the final two pictures are what are called reticules. And at the end of the French Revolution, because those big skirts went away, so did the pockets that were tied around the waist, and they were worn under dresses. There were 2 pockets to each set, and they were embroidered as well, usually. If the person had the money to do that, or they could do it on their own, you can see they're pretty fancy when you look at the pictures. And those pockets had little slits, so they could go through their dress with just like side seams that were open, and they could reach in and reach into the pocket and get sewing implements or whatever they needed. So you'll see the group of very fancy reticules on the left, and on the right, another one. So it's the first time a woman had to carry a bag outside of her dress. And that's because the dress became so slim, there was no more room for pockets. So I love the accessories from this period. So that is it for today. As I mentioned, next time I'm here, probably in a couple of weeks, I will be bringing in a number of clothing from my own wardrobe, and we'll take a look at, well, how can you get this look? I would love to see men wearing this kind of ensemble again. I don't know if we'll ever come close to it, but if you want to experiment, there's ways to do it in a more inexpensive way. And thrifting is a really good way to do that. It's sustainable, it's secondhand, and we'll talk a lot more about that next time. So I thank you so much for joining me. You can feel free to go to my website, SpiritsOfFashion.com. And I have a newsletter, I have presentations, there's a Google Calendar where you can see where I'm going to be presenting various fashion eras. So thank you for listening and being here today, and I'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.